Hello, Ross Ketschke here with EIV News. We're sitting with Green Party candidate Dr. Jill Stein. Welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Great to be here.
All right, well, let's get right to it. So you are the candidate for the Green Party for the 2016 election, and you've had a long-standing career as both an activist and a politician here in Massachusetts. Now, as someone who's on the presidential ticket this year, how important is winning Massachusetts for any presidential candidate?
Well, as an independent third party, you may know that the system is very steeply tilted against us. When Donald Trump talks about the election being rigged, he has no clue how rigged the election is on his behalf. $4 billion worth of free primetime media for Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton got about half as much. Bernie Sanders got about half as much as that. We've essentially been locked out of media coverage, and as a third party, you have to fight very hard in order to get on the ballot. So it's a very different story as an independent third party. Our goal is to really break through the media silence. Our goal is to help empower voters, because in this election, as you may know, these are the Hillary and Donald are the most disliked and untrusted candidates ever in presidential history. And there's an enormous fear campaign going on to constrain people to voting for one or the other, mostly on behalf of Hillary Clinton. So voters are, kind of in a bind right now. They've been intimidated into feeling like they have to vote for the lesser evil. So, our goal is to, number one, let people know that we're out here, because many people, 4 out of 10 voters, according to the New York Times, are not going to vote because they don't buy into this predatory political systems that has been throwing everyday people under the bus. Lousy jobs, poverty wages for most people, health care, which is skyrocketing. Even people who have insurance can't afford to get it, and an entire generation of young people locked into debt. So, we're here to let people know there is an alternative. I'm the only candidate that is not corrupted by the money of lobbyists, corporate interests, and super PACs. So we're here to let people know there is a campaign that is of, by, and for the people, and that also has solutions to the really critical problems that people are struggling with, that the other two parties really don't even touch with a 10-foot pole.
And how are you able to break through that media silence that you said? The coverage difference is monumental. You almost can't even quantify the difference between what the two major party gets and you, or even Gary Johnson, another popular third-party candidate. What have you found most effective in breaking through that media silence, reaching to those voters who are unhappy with the major party candidates?
There are many ways, and part of it is just talking to independent media like yourself, who are not afraid to actually cover the alternatives and to inform voters, which is supposed to be the job, of the press. We have a press in order to have an educated electorate. So it's talking to the independent press, it's also through social media, it's through our websites, it's through our Facebook page, it's through doing live streams like this. And I encourage people to go to jill2016.com or to our Facebook page or our Twitter, Dr. Jill Stein, and that's Dr. no period Jill Stein, and find out about how we can, for example, bail out the students. We bailed out the crooks on Wall Street to the tune of $16 trillion. We can certainly afford to bail out an entire generation that is locked in student debt. We can also stop these insane, catastrophic wars, these regime change wars, which are costing us more than half of our discretionary budget. Almost half of your income taxes are going into these wars, which have done what? Given us failed states, mass refugee migrations, and worse terrorist threats. They're not making it better, they're actually making it worse. We're the only campaign that's talking about a foreign policy based on international law, human rights, not on brute military force. So these are the kinds of things that people are really dying to know about. Go to our website, find out more. The election is not over. People are still really really clamoring for another option of politics of integrity, because the more we see of these two candidates, the more we learn that one is the kind of the sexual predator and the other one is the queen of corruption. And people are not happy voting for either, and it's really important, I think, for us to have the courage of our convictions and to know, for example, just the number of young people locked into student loan debt. That alone is enough to actually win this election. If people actually came out and voted for the only campaign, and you're looking at it, that will put an end to student debt and actually make public higher education free.
And I know that's one of the biggest policies that that you're running on is forgiving America's student debt. And a question about that: there's an estimated $1.2 trillion in student debt, and you referenced the major Wall Street bailout back in the late 2000s. With a national debt of currently roughly around $18 trillion, how do you plan on affording to essentially buy out that extra $1.2 trillion in student debt in addition to our national debt?
So there are several ways that we can pay for that debt. One of them would be to redirect the money. Right now there's $1 trillion that's going into creating a new generation of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons should actually be abolished. We should be really intensifying efforts for nuclear abolition. Instead of resisting them, which unfortunately our current administration and the past many administrations, Democrats and Republicans, have been very much a party to this new nuclear arms race. According to Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, we are at the most dangerous moment ever in human history in terms of the potential for nuclear war. So there's every reason to be backing off. $1 trillion going into a new generation of nuclear weapons under the current administration. How about instead we just redirect that money to a new generation of young people, not a new generation of nukes, but a new generation of young people who deserve to be bailed out. It always takes the vision and the genius of the younger generation to remake our economy. Right now they're missing in action. They're held hostage in debt. They've got two hands tied behind their back. We need to liberate them to lead the way forward. So redirecting this disastrous nuclear weapons project is one way. Another way is let's tax Wall Street. Let's tax the crooks that we bailed out, who crashed the economy through their waste, fraud, and abuse. This is the only sector of the economy that does not pay a sales tax. A small 0.2% sales tax on Wall Street transactions would generate close to $400 billion a year. We could have the student debt paid off within a year or two. And remember, this is an investment into the stimulus package of our dreams, because we're talking about 43 million people who already have the skills. They have the degree, they have the training. They need to be turned loose so that they can take the risks to create the small businesses, the nonprofits, the worker cooperatives, so that they are actually creating the economic engine of the economy of the future.
Absolutely. You touched there on redirecting money from things like the nuclear program. You have proposed budget cuts to the national defense budget. Now, with the current international state being very toxic, let's say, very volatile right now, between the violence in Syria, escalating tensions with Russia, and the ever-growing threat of cybersecurity, with redirecting that money around, how do you plan to also keep America and our allies safe both home and abroad?
Great. So first, it's important to remember our current policy is not keeping us safe. It's actually endangering us. Not only that it creates more chaos and violence in the Middle East, but that violence blows back at us. And it's well known, a number of studies have shown that the main cause of sort of this ISIS-identified violence, which is not a formal connection with ISIS, it's just identification.
Inspired.
Exactly. The main source of that is actually the violence that's, and the bombs and the occupations, starting with Osama bin Laden. He was very clear that he wanted U.S. troops out of Saudi Arabia, and out of the Holy Land. So, this policy of occupation, of supporting dictatorships and tyranny for the sake of preserving our oil resources, this has been a disaster. That disaster is continuing. Where did ISIS come from? ISIS came from the chaos of Iraq and Libya. Thank you, Hillary Clinton for her part in that, particularly Libya, where she led the charge against the better instincts of many in the Department of Defense who were resisting it to start with. That's why Hillary Clinton, in my view, is as dangerous as anyone. She's absolutely as dangerous as Donald Trump to be in the White House. But we can have a different kind of foreign policy that stops these interventions, the violence, and the regime change, because that is what is making us not only endangered, but it's also devouring half of our discretionary budget. This is making us bankrupt. And that's essential for our security, to actually address our needs here at home and stop fanning the flames of violence overseas. We call for a foreign policy based on international law and human rights, not on brute military force. And the other thing is that we call for actually a real intervention, a new kind of offensive in the Middle East, a peace offensive in the Middle East. We're not talking about just throwing up our hands and walking away. We're talking about having a principled intervention. So number one, we start with a weapons embargo to all parties, because right now our weapons are winding up in the hands of all parties, and we are the major supplier of weapons to the Middle East. And we need to engage others, not only our allies, but also the Russians as well, who are also paying a very devastating price right now, both for terrorism, as well as they cannot afford their military budget right now either. Their economy is in deep trouble. So we need to productively engage, as many foreign policy experts are now recommending. We cannot have a world of U.S. domination, which used to be the kind of the paradigm, is that the U.S. would dominate the Middle East, we would dominate Asia, and everything would be fine. It's not worked out fine at all. We need a collaborative way forward. We need a way based on principled negotiation and finding common ground. We need to establish a weapons embargo, and we also need to put a freeze on the bank accounts of those countries who continue to fund terrorist enterprises. It's been established through many sources, including Hillary Clinton herself, that, as Secretary of State, that the Saudis are still the major funder of terrorist extremism around the world. So we can stop the funding, and we can stop the flow of weapons, and use our moral authority to really convene serious ceasefire and peace negotiations, starting in Syria.
And now moving to your environmental policy, being the candidate of the Green Party that is one of the main focuses of your campaign, what are some of your proposals to combat climate change, both here in the U.S. and around the world?
Great. So we want to start with a policy here in the U.S. and lead the way forward and lead with our actions. So we're calling for an emergency jobs program that solves the emergency of climate change, solves them both together. You cannot solve one or the other, and the powers that be want to pit us, against each other, so that it's workers who are fighting for jobs against people who are fighting for climate justice and for their water supply and to stop the floods and the sea level rise and all that. It's got to be done together. We cannot have an economy if we don't have a stable climate and water and food and so on. And on the other hand, we cannot have a stable climate if we're not meeting human needs with a good economy and good jobs. So this isn't rocket science how to do this. We call for basically a Green New Deal. So it's like the New Deal that got us out of the Great Depression, but it's a green one, so it will also solve the climate crisis. So we call for 20 million jobs. This is a major job creation program. Jobs at good wages, at living wages, focused on the energy transition to 100% clean renewables by 2030. We're not talking the end of the century. We're talking about doing this in real time, in time to actually solve the climate crisis. And the science tells us it needs to be like now. By 2030, we need to have phased out fossil fuels. We also call for a transition in agriculture so that we have sustainable, local, healthy food systems to bring back the small farmers and the community farms. And we call for public transportation, which is also essential if we're going to reduce our carbon footprint. Public transportation that is renewably powered and efficient, as well as restoring our ecosystems as part of infrastructure, critical infrastructure, and essential services. So it's a whole spectrum of jobs, but the point is it gets the job done on an emergency basis. You think like, Pearl Harbor was an emergency. We declared a national emergency, and we converted the economy from 0% on a wartime footing to 25% on a wartime footing. And you know how long it took? It took us 6 months to do that because we understood there was an emergency. We have an emergency now that makes Pearl Harbor look like small potatoes because the science is telling us we're going to lose all harbors, including, Boston Harbor and the island of Manhattan and the state of Florida, and essentially coastal population centers all around the country and all around the world. The country of Bangladesh will all be underwater. These studies are now saying we could see as much as 10 feet of sea level rise as soon as 2050. So I think a lot of the listeners out there in the Emerson audience, that's like on your watch. Okay, and I think a lot of young people know that we have a real generational emergency going on.
It's absolutely within our lifetime.
Exactly. And just imagine if we had flooding of all coastal zones, say 10 feet. Now, the studies predict a range. It could be as soon as 2050. It could also be 100 years from then. However, what Jim Hansen, the father of climate science, says is that it's likely to be at the near end, not the far end, given what the science is saying right now. So I think we have to take this seriously, and we have to err on the safe side. So we got to do stuff now. If we lost all coastal harbors, not only would we have toxic waste sites all over, basically an ocean of toxic waste, but we'd have nuclear power plants going Fukushima all over the place, including our own Pilgrim plant, which is at sea level. Because you know what happens when nuclear power plants flood? You get a Fukushima. So this is not a crisis we want to have to deal with. Right now we have 65 million refugees worldwide, largely from war. But if we add, if we have a climate crisis with 10 feet of sea level rise, that will add an additional 650 million refugees. So take the crisis we can't handle right now, multiply it by 10, and that's what it looks like. Plus we have no harbors, we have no infrastructure. Everything comes to a grinding halt. So we can't go there. We need to take action right now, declare an emergency, and actually get down to the business of creating these jobs. The cost of doing this would be approximately $500 billion for the first year, because there would be national incentives to get these small businesses up and running, to get the jobs going that are going to create this transition. But these are jobs that then prime the pump of the economy. So the costs reduce on an annual basis very soon after that. And here are the offsets for that. Number one, by moving to 100% clean renewable energy, we don't need the friggin' wars for oil. So we can redirect hundreds of billions of dollars from the military into this transition. But here's the other very important offset. We get so much healthier when we eliminate fossil fuel pollution. According to the studies, we save so much money by ending fossil fuels, because then you have less asthma, less emphysema, heart attacks, strokes, and cancers. A lot of stuff that costs a lot of money, kills 200,000 people every year. And then that's just the tip of the iceberg. So we save so much money by getting healthier. The costs of the green energy transition are actually paid for within about a decade and a half just from the healthcare savings alone. So yes, there's a cost, but not paying that cost basically is curtains, So we don't have much choice. And again, this is an investment that we must make that will be incredibly productive and will help get our economy back in shape. In many ways, the Green New Deal is the antidote to NAFTA. NAFTA, which took our jobs overseas and shut down our factories. The Green New Deal does exactly the opposite. It opens up our factories, it recreates manufacturing, and it recreates a whole agricultural base, and does this at the local level where the money recirculates. This isn't money going to multinational corporations who take the profits and run. This leaves the money in the community where it recirculates and creates a real recovery that we need. So in summary, the Green New Deal revives the economy, it turns around the climate change crisis, it makes the wars for oil obsolete, and it pays for itself just in the health benefits alone.
And one of the parts of that Green New Deal is switching to electric vehicles. I was reading up on that. Now, currently, energy consumption makes up about 25% of transportation. Transportation takes up a lot of our energy, and some of the green energy creation methods that you've proposed only make up right now about 5% of our energy creation. So how do you plan on kind of bridging that gap?
So what we're talking about is completely replacing our electricity supply so that fossil fuels are eliminated from that. We're also talking about in transportation so that we will have a mass public transportation system which is renewably powered, and that could essentially provide that public transit component. And then food. and agricultural system is about another 25% or so. So we are talking about replacing all of the fossil fuel inputs in our energy system so that we won't need any of it with the Green New Deal. So you can ask, so how do you actually achieve this? It's one thing to provide the jobs that will be making the transition, but how do you shut down the fossil fuels? Mm-hmm. So there are two methods there. One is that we call for a carbon tax that actually begins to add the real externalized costs of fossil fuels to the cost of fossil fuels. But we do this at the same time that we're making renewables widely available. So for example, here in Massachusetts, the solar industry is kept under wraps by the legislature's refusal to remove the cap on the, on the provision of solar energy into our electricity grid. It's basically how the utility companies make sure that they stay in charge here, and they don't allow the small producers to actually start producing that solar energy that we need. That's a real problem. So we would basically create a carbon tax on fossil fuels that will further incentivize the green energy. But we would also require that the EPA step up to its full mandate. The EPA's charge is to protect human health and the environment. Well, if in fact the science is telling us that we are headed for the collapse of civilization as soon as 2050 with a 10-foot sea level rise, the EPA needs to act on that. That is part of our health as well. Our health also requires civilization. Our health is not consistent with going extinct. So we would then empower the EPA to essentially begin shutting down fossil fuels in the same way that the EPA is pulling back on other forms of air pollution and is attempting now to pull back on carbon pollution from coal plants. We would expand that mandate to include all sources of fossil fuels. And in particular, Massachusetts is fighting pipelines and has done a heroic job of...
You know something about fighting pipelines yourself, just being in North Dakota a few weeks ago.
You're not kidding. And that fight is an incredibly courageous fight that I think really represents, it's kind of a microcosm of what our struggle is right now. It is a struggle for water. It is a struggle for climate. And it is a struggle for human rights and democracy, all of which are being abused. And I'll say, I was charged with being a vandal for spray painting on the blade of a bulldozer. The blade of a bulldozer, which gets from which anything will be erased the first time that blade is used. I would say the real vandals here is the Dakota Access Pipeline Company, who is vandalizing our water, our air, our climate, and our human rights of the indigenous people in particular. But Massachusetts is also fighting and recently stopped the Kinder Morgan pipeline, and now heroically people are fighting the Spectra West Roxbury pipeline, which is a very dangerous high pressure pipeline where the power station is going to be like right across from an active quarry where there's blasting. It's just like unthinkable, the risks that are being taken with people's lives right now. This is just a classic case of putting profit over people, and it's very important that we stand up, support the courageous people, whether in North Dakota or in West Roxbury, who are standing up for the climate, for our water supply, for our safety, for an America and a world that works for all of us. The power to create that world is not in our hopes, it's not in our dreams, it really is in our hands. We encourage people, don't throw your vote away on a failed two-party system. Invest your vote in a movement for real change. Our party, the Green Party, and our campaign is very close to the 5% threshold at which we become a recognized national political party. We get $10 million to really run the race in the next campaign, to be able to run it as a full-powered, people-powered political campaign. And it also means we're on the ballot in most states, so we can hit the ground running and provide the challenge that the American people are clamoring for. Most people are calling for an independent political party right now. People are only voting for both candidates, actually. Polls show that each of the supporters for Donald Trump, people don't really support him. They're just really afraid of Hillary Clinton. And for Hillary Clinton, the majority of her supporters don't really support her. They're just afraid of Donald Trump. We need a voting system that liberates us. It's called ranked choice voting. My campaign actually proposed this. We filed a bill together with a Democratic legislator back in 2002. That bill has been kept in committee for about 16 years.
Oh, wow.
Because the Democrats rely on fear. Why do they rely on fear? Because they're not your friend. They have to extort your vote. They have to intimidate you into voting for them by only allowing you one other terrible choice of the scary Republicans. Liberating your vote calls their bluff. They do not want you to be able to have choice of your vote. So I think as a first order of business coming out of this campaign, we're going to be really focusing on ranked choice voting so that we can liberate our vote and stop this fear campaigning, because it is a race to the bottom between the Democrat and the Republican. Each election, they are more corporatist, militarist, imperialist, and we the people continue to be thrown under the bus in a way we may not be able to recover from. In this election, we're not just deciding what kind of world we're going to have, but whether we're going to have a world, considering the climate, nuclear weapons, and expanding war, not to mention a generation that's locked into predatory debt. We can fix these problems. It really depends on our standing up and asserting the power that we have. I encourage you, use the power of your vote to invest in a real movement for deep change. Don't throw your vote away on more of what's throwing you under the bus.
We're running out of time, but thank you very much for joining me today. For EIV News, I'm Ross Ketschke with Green Party candidate Jill Stein at Old South Church in Boston. Thank you for joining us.